Humanity's history is rife with stories and legends of unimaginably terrible ways to die. From ancient torture methods to a slow death at the hands of nature, there are so many terrible fates that plague our stories. But in spite of all of that, I have never heard of a death as horrifyingly painful as the death of Hisashi Uchi. Hello everybody, today we are going to be talking about the 1999 Tokaimura nuclear incident and the tragic fate that befell one man because of it. This story is one that, again, if you're strange like me and listen to disturbing stories on YouTube, you might have heard of before. Images of Hisashi's injuries, some real and some fake, have circulated the internet as being the most radioactive man to ever live. But in research for this video, the details that stuck out to me were the graphic and almost unimaginable injuries that overtook his body. Some of the most brutal descriptions I have ever read in a medical case. So today, while also talking about the story of Hisashi, his family, the medical team that tried to save his life, and his bosses who were responsible for this accident, I also want to talk about several of the injuries that were sustained and why this case left a lasting impact on everyone who was attached to it. So I want to put a content warning now. If you are squeamish about descriptions of injuries and some pictures of injuries, do not watch this video. I didn't even know that some of these injuries were possible, much less over the period of time and intensity that they occurred. I have legitimately lost sleep reading books and interviews with people who were involved, and it has bothered me regarding the question of when is a life worth saving, or more specifically, when does it stop being worth saving? And it is a very tragic case, but one that I think deserves telling. So if that sounds interesting to you, or it's sad, it's not interesting, if that is something you want to hear about and go on this existential voyage with me, then stick around as we talk about the most painful death ever experienced of Hisashi Uchi. But before we get into all of that, stop! Smell yourself. Disgusting. Let's fix that. And fix that smell the right way thanks to today's sponsor, Scentbird. Scentbird changes everything you know about shopping for fragrances. Scentbird lets you try a new designer fragrance every month for just $17. Scentbird lets you try out fragrances and colognes that otherwise should cost up to $500 a bottle. But with Scentbird, you get a 30-day supply and you get to pick the fragrance yourself. And if you don't know what kind of fragrance you want, Scentbird even has a Q&A where you can answer questions and see what kind of fragrance is right for you. This month I received Dime No. 1, Initio's Musk Therapy, and Ayuso Vert Yoga. I hope you all appreciate my butchered pronunciations. My favorite out of these has got to be the Dime No. 1 just because it's kind of a clean, strong scent that is similar to a lot of other colognes I like. And while this selection would normally cost me hundreds of dollars, with Scentbird, it's one easy subscription. They even come in these cool capsules now where it locks. Like if you do it like that, you can fritz it. But if you turn it to the side, it locks in place, so it doesn't come out or accidentally spray while you're traveling with it, or put it in your pocket, which is a very nice touch. It's very thoughtful. I like it. And now, you can get it on this fantastic offer as well for over half off. That is right, more than half off, because if you go to the link in the description at scentbird.com and use my discount code, Wendigoon55, you'll be able to get 55% off your Scentbird subscription. Or in other words, just over $7. So if you're interested in getting these designer fragrances at a major discount, then once again, go to the link in the description and use discount code Wendigoon55 to get 55% off. This is definitely a deal you don't want to miss out on. Thank you all so much for watching the ad. Thank you so much to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description, and we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. In 1999, Hisashi worked for the Japanese Nuclear Fuel Conversion Company, or JCO. JCO owned several nuclear or nuclear-adjacent facilities around Japan. One of these was the Tokaimura plant that was located in the Ibaraki Prefecture of Japan. Now, the Tokaimura plant was not a nuclear facility. Instead, it was a staging area where they made the materials for nuclear reactors. In other words, there was no live nuclear reaction happening at the Tokaimura plant. Instead, they just made the fuel rods that were then sent to nuclear plants. The first stage of this process involves converting uranium hexafluoride into uranium dioxide. This involves a process of taking the uranium and then mixing it with a nitrate so that the uranium is stable enough to be moved around before it is then placed in a nuclear reactor. The way that you are supposed to do this is you take the uranium and nitric acid and you pour it into a small mixing tank. That mixture is then transferred into a large storage tank that prevents the uranium from reacting with other uranium particles and becoming too unstable. It's then ran out of the top of the storage tank and slowly fed into a precipitation tank that makes sure everything is stabilized before they begin to use it in the next steps of the process. Well, that is the government-approved safe method. The way they were doing it at the Tokaimura plant in 1999 was with a bucket. They would just take a stainless steel bucket, put uranium, nitric acid in there, mix it up, and then pour it directly into the precipitation tank. Now, this was apparently something that was happening around a lot of nuclear processing facilities at the time. Because it's cheaper than running all the heavy equipment and waiting. And despite the seemingly terrible idea of having people mix uranium in a bucket they're holding with their hands, no accidents had occurred up until this point. The reason being, even though they were handling uranium in a way you should never handle it, the concentration of uranium was never enough that it became dangerous. But if almost every uranium conversion company in Japan was being unsafe, then the Tokaimura plant was being super unsafe. See, they had a history of weird business accidents. In 1997, there was an explosion at the facility that exposed several workers and nearby residents to radioactive materials. It seems that the accident in 1997 involved them burning a bunch of trash inside of the building, inside of like a closed off area, and it just caused air and unburnt fuel to kind of evaporate, and it eventually blew up and caused a big pop. And you don't want air getting rushed out of a radioactive material burning yard, I guess. So realize we're dealing with a company who thinks it's fine to burn trash in a uranium processing plant. This was the facility that Hisashi Uchi worked at. And then one day, on September the 30th, 1999, at around 10 a.m., his boss asked him to come help with the uranium pouring process, something that Hisashi had never done before. So the boss took Hisashi and another man named Masato Hinoshara into the room to begin the conversion process. And this process straight up involved them just taking a bucket, pouring the stuff in, mixing it up, and then handing it up to one of them on the ladder so that they can just pour it into this giant storage tank. Now, in spite of this process being incredibly stupid, they were also breaking two other rules of uranium safety. For one, the correct storage tanks that you're supposed to use in this step are these really tall cylinders. And the reason for that is because if your surface area is too wide and it contains too much uranium that is close together, you can cause a nuclear accident. In simple terms, radioactive uranium is constantly shooting out neutrons. And if one of these neutrons hit another uranium molecule, it can cause a reaction. So, storage tanks are literally slimmer so that fewer uranium molecules are right next to each other. But because those storage tanks are too tall and hard to just pour buckets into the top of, they were instead using shorter, not safety-approved tanks. The other mistake they made came directly from JCO. See, JCO was 2 days behind on their order of nuclear rods, and they wanted to ramp up production. So, they had increased the concentration of uranium that the men were pouring into the tank. Typically, the concentration in the bucket is about 5% uranium, whereas at this moment with Hisashi and Masato, it's about 18%. So after they get done mixing one of the last buckets, Masato is standing on top of the tank pouring the uranium solution in, and Hisashi comes to his boss who's holding the funnel above the tank and tells his boss to go take a seat and Hisashi will take it from here. So with the 3 men in the room, one of them is on top of the tank pouring, one of them has his hands just above the tank holding the funnel, and the other one is sitting at a desk a few feet away from the tank itself. As the men are pouring the bucket into the storage tank that now contains 70 liters or nearly 20 gallons of uranium solution, disaster strikes. Suddenly, the men hear a loud clap and a glowing blue light begins to emanate from inside of the storage tank. This blue light is a phenomenon known as a Cherenkov light. Cherenkov lights occur whenever nuclear materials reach criticality. Criticality is the state of what I mentioned earlier, whenever the molecules of uranium are so close together that they have a sustaining number of neutrons hitting them and then shooting off to hit other uranium molecules. That means that the nuclear reaction just reached a self-sustaining stage, where the number of neutrons lost by the molecules and the number of neutrons gained stays constant. This is how nuclear energy works. If you put the materials inside of a reactor and then they reach criticality, then they emit energy by just existing. However, the key factor being, this is what you want to happen inside of a nuclear reactor. And criticality and the Cherenkov light can be thought as the reactor turning on. What that means is that by haphazardly pouring uranium into a storage tank, they had now turned on an uncovered nuclear reactor in the middle of the Tokamura district. And the 3 men who were in that room had the rare misfortune of being some of the only people in human history to ever see a completely exposed nuclear reaction. As soon as this happened at 10:35 a.m., alarms all across the plant went off. Their boss, who was sitting at the table a few feet away, yelled, "Run for your lives," and everyone booked it for the door. Hisashi made it into a changing room that connected the room they were in to the rest of the facility. As soon as Hisashi made it into that room, he began throwing up and passed out. At the moment of criticality, the neutron beams that were being emitted in the reaction hit everyone in the room. These neutron beams rip through flesh, tissue, material, and radiate everything they come into contact with. Sievert is a measure of radiation exposure, and the amount of sieverts that it is deemed healthy to be exposed to per year is about 1/1000th of 1 sievert. Or in other words, about 1 millisievert a year. If you're a nuclear worker, sometimes you can fudge the numbers and go a little bit over, but never over like 20 millisieverts a year. So keep in mind, 1 is the safe amount for a year. At the moment of criticality, the boss who was sitting at the desk was exposed to about 3,000 millisieverts. Masato, who was pouring the bucket, was exposed to about 8,000 millisieverts. And Hisashi, who was standing next to the tank and had his hand hanging over it, was exposed to about 20,000. Now 7 to 8,000 millisieverts is considered a lethal dose, and initially they thought that Hisashi had been exposed to about 8,000, so maybe there was a chance to save him. But by looking at the chromosomal damage that happened to him, which we'll talk about in a minute, it seems the number was closer to 20,000. So Hisashi experienced 20,000 times the safe amount of radiation that you can take in a year in a few seconds, and somehow was still alive. The moment of criticality caused a huge panic. Within 350 meters of the plant, all houses were evacuated, and up to 10 kilometers away, they were telling people to seek shelter. In the meantime, the workers, including Hisashi, Masato, and their boss, were all evacuated from the facility. And after about 20 hours, they managed to stop the criticality. Because of the amount of uranium that was in the storage tank, it was still a very low amount compared to, a nuclear reactor, so there weren't any permanent effects to the region. However, the same couldn't be said for those 3 men. That same day, a doctor by the name of Meikawa was called regarding the incident. Meikawa was one of Japan's leading experts when it came to radiation sickness and radiation treatment. After learning that the incident at the plant was a criticality incident, Meikawa was amazed that anyone survived at all. So, Meikawa began to put together a team to assess the condition of the 3 victims. The boss had again been exposed to about 3,000 millisieverts, which isn't uncommon in nuclear material accidents, and we'll talk about what happened to him later. Masato was also assessed, but since he didn't receive as much radiation as Hisashi, his case was less critical, and again, we'll talk about what happened to him later. Meikawa's primary concern was Hisashi, who initially, remember, they thought received about 8,000 millisieverts, which is a lethal dose, so he required the most immediate care, although it would later turn out to be more than double that. The first signs that something was really bad with Hisashi, other than the throwing up, which is pretty typical of radiation exposure, was his lymphocyte count. Lymphocytes are an important part of your immune system and a part of your white blood cell content. In a healthy person, the concentration of lymphocytes in your white blood cells is 25 to 48% depending. Whenever they got the results back of Hisashi that were taken 9 hours after exposure, his was down to 1.9%. So his immune system was tanking fast. Meikawa visits Hisashi in the hospital, and to Meikawa's surprise, Hisashi looks fine. The only symptoms he had was a red face and bloodshot eyes. And the only pain that he said he was currently experiencing was a pain just under his right ear and a pain in his right hand. If you'll remember, his right hand was the closest part of his body to the nuclear reaction. Now, while this may sound shocking, this is actually to be expected. Radiation sickness occurs in 4 stages. The first stage, known as the prodrome stage, is the initial literal gut reaction to radiation exposure. Whenever someone's bombarded with a lot of radiation, they may throw up or have diarrhea as kind of a quick nauseous attempt to expel materials from within the body. But then after that typically only lasts a few hours, there's something called the latency period. In the second stage, the body is being destroyed by the radiation and the symptoms of it aren't made known yet. While there may be some pain and discomfort, the patient is normally fine during this period of time. However, following the latency period is the manifestation stage. That's when the damage the radiation caused begins to be made known, as the person can develop anything from an immune system shutdown to skin burning and several other symptoms we're about to see. And then after that, the 4th stage is either recovery or death. So during this period of time, the radiation is destroying Hisashi's body. The effects just aren't known to him or others around yet. And Meikawa, who's seen this before, knows that this is the radiation's theoretical rising of the hammer, and he wants to be there whenever the hammer strikes. So Meikawa has Hisashi transported to his team and his facility at the Tokyo University Hospital. The transfer happens on October the 2nd. 3 days after his exposure. The first device used to artificially assist Hisashi is a breathing apparatus. See, his chest began to hurt as he would breathe, so he began to take very short and shallow breaths. So they hooked him up to a breathing mask that essentially forced his lungs to breathe through the pain. Now, in radiation sickness, the first parts of the body that are destroyed are the mucosal membranes and your immune system. So any part of your body that secretes something like the lining of your intestine or salivary glands in your mouth or mucus glands in your nose, those are almost always fried, meaning that processes like digestion become a lot more difficult. And radiation has a particularly strong effect on your bone marrow, meaning that your entire immune system production is either stopped entirely or delayed for some time. That means that with patients who are suffering from radiation sickness, it is very hard to keep nutrients in their body, and it's also very hard to make sure they don't get sick. Because an otherwise harmless infection can quickly become lethal when their body has no way to fight it off. So because of this, the 2 private rooms at the Tokyo University Hospital were effectively turned into a quarantine zone. Now, typically with radiation patients, it is a risk of people around the patient becoming irradiated. That's because most often, radiation exposure comes from radioactive materials. Like, for example, if there is a fire and the smoke's irradiated and that gets on people, or they come into contact with irradiated water, or something radioactive explodes and they touch the debris from the explosion, then that person is not only exposed to radiation, but there is enough of the material on or in their body that they can expose people around them to radiation. However, if there's any upside to this case, it's this. That wasn't the case with Hisashi, because if you'll remember, he never came into contact with the materials. It was just the fact that a small nuclear reactor was uncapped right next to him that caused him to be irradiated. So while people who came to treat Hisashi would have to fully deck out and take precautions so that they don't get radiation sickness, because this scenario is so unique and a criticality incident, the doctors and nurses didn't have to worry about exposure. What they did have to worry about was exposing Hisashi to anything. Remember, his immune system shot, so they could have a bacteria or virus on them that is harmless to them, but if they get near Hisashi, it could kill him. So the 2 private rooms at the hospital were converted into a sterile field, where one room was used for staging and cleaning and sterile materials, and the next room, that was fitted with curtains on all sides, held Hisashi. All of the nurses and doctors said that Hisashi was a pleasure to be around. They said that as they would hand him food or rearrange his pillow or sheets, that he would constantly say thank you, and how he's so honored to have such kind and smart people caring after him. One of the nurses even said that whenever she would come to give Hisashi a bath in his bed, because he can't get up to take a shower, that every time she'd undress him, he would blush and say that he was so embarrassed and that they should just have his wife come do it. They would talk to him about his personal life, how he loved to go fishing and loved the outdoors. And despite the severity of his exposure, everyone was amazed that his body, even after several days, seemed to be in good condition. Other than things like he needed the respirator to assist with his breathing, there seemed to be no external effect on his body yet. That right hand that was so close to the accident, the nurses said that it just seemed it was sunburnt. And despite his exposure, all of the nurses were so hopeful of his condition and wanted him to live that on the charts during this time, they wrote that their goal was to get him out of the hospital. Also during this time, Mikawa was assembling a team of the highest physicians from 13 different departments. People who were experts at cell therapy, blood transfusions, gastroenterology, dermatology, just to name a few. Most of them took this job not only to help a patient, but because in all of human history, no one had ever been exposed to that amount of radiation and lived. And everyone on the team was aware that, despite being the forerunners in their field, they were stepping into completely uncharted territory. So, this team developed a system. Every day, they would go in at 7 a.m. to assess Hisashi's condition. From there, at 8 a.m., they would have a meeting where they would discuss treatments and what to do for the rest of the day. There would then be a second meeting at 6 p.m. where they would review how the treatments from that day performed and what they should do for the night and day to come. These meetings occurred twice a day in a conference room at the Tokyo University Hospital for every single day that Hisashi was there. These meetings would contain dozens of people, specialists in their field to nurses who were providing care, and sometimes would last as long as 2 hours. Most of the staff who were working the case effectively lived in the hospital while Hisashi was there. And while the experts knew that the worst was yet to come, hopes were high. They had the best minds in Japan gathered around this guy. And even though everyone knows that radiation has a latency period and that it's going to get bad any day now, there is no better place to get sick than in a professional hospital with dozens of the best minds in the world ready to treat you. During this time, Hisashi's family began to live in the hospital as well. Hisashi's wife, son, who was in the 3rd grade, parents, sister, and brother-in-law practically lived in the waiting room on the 1st floor of the hospital. All of them began to develop relationships with the doctors and nurses, and they would come and see Hisashi every single time that visitation hours were allowed. However, according to nurses, Hisashi's son only saw him once, and it's believed by many that the mother didn't want the son to see his father as his condition worsened. One of the nurses also mentioned that during this first week, Hisashi was sitting in his bed and then asked, "Hey, people who are exposed to radiation were likely to develop leukemia, right?" And the nurse was kind of taken back by this and told him that he shouldn't worry about it. And the tragedy set in that he doesn't realize what's about to happen. Because leukemia, a disease that can develop over time and could take months or years to be fatal, is nothing compared to what's about to happen to him very soon. The first signs of how bad this was going to be happened on October the 5th. The doctors took a sample of Hisashi's bone marrow to see how bad his immune system had been shot. And when they looked at the micrograph, most of them couldn't believe what they were seeing. So, for context, chromosomes are the part of your body that is effectively the blueprint for how your body is built. Your chromosomes exist in every cell, and without them, your body can't build anything. You can kind of think of it as both the foundation and map for how new cells are reproduced. So if your chromosomes are damaged, then that means any new cells reproduced by that cell are going to be damaged or malformed as well. When they looked at the micrograph for what Hisashi's bone marrow looked like, this is a healthy person's chromosome mapping, and this is what Hisashi's looked like. This isn't damage to your immune system. This is an erasing of your immune system. The experts couldn't even look at this and tell which of the chromosomes were damaged or destroyed, because then there may be some way to treat it. It was just seen that all of them had been wiped out. The doctors had imagined that a transplant would be needed, but now there's no question of if Hisashi's body can ever recover, because right now it doesn't even have the tools to make new immune cells. After seeing the severity of this, they began a new procedure where they did something called a PCR test. And PCR tests had been a thing for a while, but in 1999, there was a new way that you could get results within a few hours rather than sending it off to a laboratory. A PCR test allows you to see the very early stages of an infection, either a virus, bacteria, or fungus, so that you can see if a microbe is present before it starts to show symptoms. So they did this on Hisashi multiple times a day because if this guy gets like a cold, it will kill him fast because his body has zero defense. Some other figures for you nerds out there like myself, his white blood cell count was about 900, which is a tenth of what it should be, and his platelet count was about 26,000. Healthy people are between 120 and 380,000. So the first order of business is getting this guy a marrow transplant. Their best option for this is a stem cell graft, where stem cells are placed into the bone marrow, where hopefully his system will accept the transplant and then use that chromosomal code as the new blueprint so that it can rebuild his bone marrow. The problem with this is the donor and recipient have to be an exact match on their HLA, or the leukocyte antigens. However, thankfully, despite siblings only having a 1 in 4 chance of being a match, Hisashi's sister was a match. And his sister was more than willing to give up whatever her brother needed to keep him alive. So they gave her a drug that increased the stem cell production in her blood and then did a peripheral blood transfusion. In other words, typically they have to go into the bone marrow and take a sample, but all they did here was spike her body with a lot of stem cells, and then they hooked her up to a machine that took the blood out of her body, separated the blood from the stem cells, and then put the blood back into her body. Now, whereas a normal donation would require a not huge amount of stem cells, they had to rebuild Hisashi's body from scratch. And they ended up taking 160 milliliters of stem cells from Hisashi's sister in a process that took 4.5 hours. So they gave him the transfusion and just had to wait to see if it would take root. In the meantime, the effects were beginning to set in for Hisashi. At first, as mentioned, there was a few minor pains, and then he had trouble breathing, and he began to get very thirsty and dehydrated. Again, his body can't produce any more mucosal linings, so his entire system's going dry. The most frightening development came when, just after a week since his exposure, he began to lose pieces of his skin en masse. It began whenever they would take off the medical tape that was on him to change out tubes or needles. It would just rip entire sections of skin off. At the same time, the nurses who were washing his feet had to stop because anytime they'd scrub his feet, the skin would just peel off. Remember that whole system I described with the bone marrow, where typically the cells that need to be regenerated can't be regenerated anymore? Well, the same applied to Hisashi's skin. Skin, for those that don't know, is constantly growing from the lowest layer of the skin, or the subcutaneous layer, up to the epidermis. In about 2 weeks, the top layer of your skin goes through a complete cycle, and the dead cells simply fall off. But if your body can't produce new cells, then your entire layer of skin just kind of detaches from the rest of you, and you just exist in it like it's some sort of suit. And this dead layer of skin that was disconnected but still completely wrapped around him was just coming off in clumps. The only bright side to this being, since the skin was effectively dead and detached in several spots, it didn't cause a lot of bleeding. Because bleeding was also a major concern. If you'll remember, his platelet count was super low, meaning that even the most minor cut or puncture could theoretically cause him to bleed out. Because if he starts bleeding, his body has no way to stop it. On October the 6th, they did an x-ray to see what the issue with his lungs were. They figured that there was obviously radiation damage, but perhaps something was putting pressure on his lungs that was causing his labored breathing. In the x-ray, they saw a dark shadow over his lungs. This could be anything from a fluid buildup or perhaps blood seeping into the lung cavity. However, where the normal treatment for this would just be puncturing a hole in the lung and then drawing the fluid out, if you'll remember, they're afraid to make him start bleeding because they're afraid they can't stop it. So the only thing they can do is just crank up the machine to make him breathe through the pressure. So the machine went from helping him breathe and just, providing oxygen to actively shoving the air into his mouth, causing his chest to expand and then sucking it back out. Meaning that anytime Hisashi tried to breathe normally, he was fighting against the positive and negative pressure of the machine. Not to mention that the intensity of the burning he was feeling both inside of his body and from the layer of skin that was beginning to slop off was now even more intense. So when they cranked this machine up, it was excruciating. It was every part of his body that was a part of respiration burning and yelling at him to stop, and the machine breathing for him anyway. As they did it, Hisashi cried and screamed through the machine, telling them to stop, to turn it off. He yelled for his wife and for his mom. And during the treatment, he pushed the nurses back, ripped off the mask, and yelled, "I'm not a guinea pig." This took everyone in the room back. But after someone mentioned Hisashi's family, he realized that, although painful, he needs to endure it for them. So he allowed the mask to be put back on and suffered through it. Also, during this time, you're probably asking, why aren't they giving him pain medication? And the answer is that they are, but it's probably not doing a lot. See, for one, they had to figure out the amount of medication they could give him that didn't have any side effects with any of the other dozens of drugs that were running through his system. And also, it turns out from later stages of what happened to him, his blood flow was effectively shot, and a lot of stuff that was delivered intravenously had trouble going anywhere. So even if he was burning and hurting in his chest and face whenever the machine was breathing for him, giving him a shot in the arm to numb it probably didn't help a ton. Which, speaking of drugs, there were so many weird advancements, or I guess advancements made in pharmaceuticals just because of this case. Like, there's a drug called pentoxifylline, which was recently banned in Japan that normally existed in oral form because I believe it had heart or liver problems or something like that. But it was the only drug that didn't, cause side effects with other drugs that were in his system. So they tried to get approval from the Japanese government to use it, and then after like a week they did, but then, as mentioned, a lot of his mucosal lining's falling apart, so he can't ingest it, so it eventually ends up with them finding a dealer in Thailand who can get them the raw ingredients for a venous version that can be injected. So a doctor drives to an airport at 6 a.m. where this delivery of a vial of this medicine is handed to him from Thailand, and he drives it back to the hospital. Multiple times they had to get the raw ingredients of drugs and synthesize them in new ways on site so that they could deliver them in different methods. Also around this time, doctors from all over the world were coming to assist in this case. Doctors and researchers who had worked at Chernobyl, members of American, Russian, and German delegations, Around the same time that these people started showing up, about October the 10th, Hisashi gave his final messages with his own words to his wife and family. Something that the nurses mentioned is that never in Hisashi's presence did his wife ever cry. The mother and father would come in and cry, the sister would cry in front of him, but every single time that Hisashi's wife walked into that room, she was smiling, she was talking about memories of how they met each other, she was talking about how strong and handsome he is. Not once around him did she ever shed a tear, because his wife knew that if she breaks down, then what else would Hisashi have to go off of? And she wanted to be that picture for him of something to keep living for. So on October the 10th, Hisashi gave his final messages to his wife of how much he loved her before he was placed on a breathing tube. The machine that was pumping oxygen over his mouth couldn't last for long. It was putting a strain on his throat and obviously the pain in his body. So they decided to hook him up to a breathing tube. October the 10th was the last time Hisashi ever spoke, which means that his final words was most likely an "I love you" to his wife. They could still communicate with him after this. He was still conscious and he could look at people. He would answer yes or no questions with a nod or a shake. He would grasp people's hands and point at things. So his consciousness was still good for now, and everyone was still hopeful that he'll eventually come off the breathing tube. Again, with radiation sickness, after the symptoms begin to form, you just have to treat the symptoms and ride it out to hopefully get to the other side, once the body has regenerated enough that it can fight back. Also during this time, Maekawa, the head doctor, had the furniture in the waiting room replaced with bright and happy colors because Hisashi's family was basically living in that waiting room. So he had new beds put in so that they could sleep there. He had board games added and just stuff to make their stay a little bit better. The family was also very supportive of the doctors and nurses. Anytime Maekawa would do something like that, they would thank him for it. And every single night, Maekawa would come down to that waiting room and give the family a very detailed description of what had happened that day. The family was very attentive. They were very thankful for the doctor's care. And something that the nurses said is that one of the only things that they would do while they were in that waiting room is they would fold little paper cranes. And the grandfather and the son would, or I should say Hisashi's father and son, would just sit at a table in the waiting room and just fold paper cranes all day. And the nurses began to enjoy, walking down to the first floor of the hospital and just seeing little paper cranes set up everywhere. And for some slight good news at the time, remember that white blood cell count? Well, it had gone all the way from 900 down to 100. But after the transfusion with his sister, it worked its way back up to 8,000 at one point. And that lymphocyte count that was all the way down at 1.9% got up to 20%. So it seems like the transfusion took, and now his body is building a new immune system. This gave a lot of people hope that in these perfect conditions, the most radioactive man who ever survived could live through the radiation sickness. And since Hisashi couldn't speak at this time, they brought stereos, sanitized of course, into the room with Hisashi, and his family would bring music that he liked, and they would just play it on a loop for him as he lay in the hospital bed. They didn't want to turn on the news because at the time, Hisashi's case was a pretty big deal in the media. Mainly because there was already a lot of controversy around nuclear energy and the JCO company. So he was being very publicized as like a victim of the company. And they didn't want the news to be on the radio and Hisashi hear a reporter say like, "And that man in the hospital who's definitely gonna die because they murdered him so hard." So rather than, filling his head with that, they would play music from his family, or they would just play sounds of nature and of water running through a brook and birds in the trees. And it seemed at this time that things were looking up. That is until they did another micrograph of his immune system. They took another micrograph to see how the chromosomes from his sister's transfusion were doing. And from that, they saw that about 10% of his sister's chromosomes were damaged. That means that even new transplants that were put into his body were being damaged. Now, if this was a radiation exposure to a radioactive material, then that might make sense. If he had inhaled, say, radioactive fumes or something, and they were still in his lungs and like across his bloodstream, that would make sense that new transplanted stuff you put in got damaged. However, it was a neutron beam that hit him. It was the equivalent of like a gunshot ripping right through him. There is no lasting effect that he should have on anything put into his body. Because, the chromosomes that were in his sister's body weren't there to get irradiated too. They showed up in his system over a week after he was exposed to radiation. And somehow they still got damaged. That is like if you got shot and needed like a liver transplant, and then a week after you get the transplant, the liver develops a bullet wound. It made no sense and had the scientists scratching their heads. Some thought it might have been radioactivation, a thing where neutron beams fly into the body, and say if it hits a particle of sodium or potassium, it can make those small particles radioactive, but that tends to go away in like less than a day. And again, the transfusion was a week afterwards. The other theory is that his body was so damaged that something called the bystander effect was happening, where free radicals of oxygen in his system were just being recycled by his system over and over again, and effectively any new cell that came into his body got damaged along with everything else. Regardless of what the reason was, Hisashi's body was so messed up that even if you gave it new cells to work with, it could not properly take care of those cells. Also around this time, on October the 15th, another major problem developed. So one of the most common causes of death of radiation sickness, besides the radiation, is gastrointestinal bleeding. So as we've established, radiation messes with your body's ability to stop bleeds. And because it also hurts your immune system, if anything gets into the body, you can get sick and die. And if anything starts to go out of the body, it's hard to stop it from going out of the body. So what happens a lot with people who experience radiation sickness is they'll start bleeding somewhere in their GI tract. And the only symptom that you can see of it is they start passing blood in their stool. And because you can't cut them open to do a surgery, because, you can't have them bleeding, then they just die from that. So one of the big concerns that Mikawa had is that if Hisashi starts bleeding in his gut, they won't be able to fix it. So a gastroenterologist does an endoscope on October the 15th. The gastroenterologist later said that this was one of the most terrifying procedures of his life because any nick or scratch that he made while he was inserting the camera could be fatal. The sight they saw in Hisashi's intestines were not great. They weren't awful either, or at least not as awful as the doctors thought they might be. They were still present. All of his intestines were very tense. They said it was most likely because of the level of pain that he had been experiencing. But where there was supposed to be alveoli that are in these little folds throughout the lower intestine, they were all just smooth. However, the mucosal membrane of the lower intestine was still there. Remember, mucosal membranes are the first thing to go. However, the part of his intestine that absorbs nutrients and secretes slime is still present. This made Mikawa hopeful, because if they can get his intestines working, then they can get all sorts of nutrients into his body. It's one thing to hook up an IV and deliver nutrients to someone straight into their bloodstream. It is another to have their body working to such a degree that it can process nutrients itself. And if they need to jumpstart his body, they're going to have to get his intestines working. So, using a feeding tube that was ran through his nose as a test, they passed 100 grams of protein into his stomach. And then a few hours later, all 100 grams of those nutrients passed straight out of his body, completely unabsorbed. Not a single element of his GI tract was bringing in nutrients, meaning that for now, his entire digestive system is over. The only hope being that, again, if they can get his blood, breathing, and immune system back in order, that his body can eventually repair the damaged cells with new ones. Also, and back to, I guess, the title or thesis of this video, you could say, I cannot properly state how much pain Hisashi was going through at this time. Like, burning doesn't even come close. The feeling of every organ inside of your body losing its skin, slowly being eroded and pulled off to the point where everything quits working. And the skin outside of your body sloughing off in these giant chunks, and you can still feel every inch of it, is excruciating in a way I don't think has ever been recreated. Perhaps by other radiation victims, but again, none of them have had to endure it as long as Hisashi has. Even breathing would feel like it was ripping apart your lungs and the muscles inside of your chest. Hopefully, the painkillers were working, but at this point, he couldn't speak to confirm it, and every time the nurses would touch any part of his body, he would tense further and begin to retract limbs as much as he could. It seemed that every waking second was agony. Also during this time, if you'll remember, that pressure and fluid on his lungs is still there, but they can't cut into his lungs to get rid of it. So they place him on this specialized bed that effectively locks your limbs into place and begin to rotate him side to side so that he doesn't get bed sores and so that the fluid in his lungs doesn't develop into pneumonia. After seeing this one day, his wife and sister remarked and said, "Oh honey, they've turned you into a robot." He stayed in the state of misery, pretty much continuing treatment as normal, until October the 26th, whenever he began to have diarrhea. Now, if you remember, they're not putting anything through his gut, so his body is just excreting fluids through diarrhea. Now, there were two options with the diarrhea. It might have been a symptom. See, I told you this video was going to be gross. It might have been just a symptom of radiation sickness, because that's something that happens with people who have radiation exposure. But they were also afraid it might be something known as graft versus host disease, or GVHD. Graft versus host disease is kind of the opposite of your body rejecting a transplant. See, if you get something like a liver transplanted into your body, there's a chance your body can reject it and your cells begin attacking it. But if you'll remember, Hisashi doesn't really have any organs that can fight back or any immune system to attack his sister's cells that were put into his body. So the fear was that what if instead of his body rejecting the transplant, what if the transplant rejects his body and his sister's healthy cells begin to attack him? Then they've made a much bigger problem. So whenever October the 26th rolled around and he began having diarrhea, they wanted to check to make sure that this wasn't graft versus host disease. So they did another endoscopy into his intestine, and remember how 10 days earlier they said that the mucus lining was still there and they thought, oh, maybe he can digest stuff. Well, on October the 26th, nothing was there. All that was left was the smooth muscle of the intestines, with the mucus layer either completely gone or white and dead hanging down in some parts of the intestine. On the bright side, this means that he doesn't have graft versus host disease because, and again, I warned you about this being gross, because the diarrhea he was excreting were the liquefied parts of his intestines. But on the downside, it's unimaginable how his digestive tract could ever come back from this. On October the 28th, world researchers began to arrive at the Tokyo University Hospital. And keep in mind, earlier experts were being flown in for help with treatment, but now researchers were coming in for theoretical treatment options or to observe him for what it might mean for radiation sickness in the future. Because prior to Hisashi, the longest a person had ever lived after being exposed to a criticality was 9 days. And October the 28th, Hisashi has been alive for 29 days. So these researchers not only come to give their assessment and advice, but now these global researchers are attending every meeting that's happening twice a day between Mikawa and the workers in the hospital. Around the time that the researchers got there, yet another new problem began to develop in Hisashi. And that was myoglobin concentrations in his blood. So myoglobin is a protein that is present in your muscles. And it seems that Hisashi's muscles were decomposing to such a degree that the proteins inside of the muscles were seeping out into his bloodstream. The reason this is a problem is because of something known as Crush syndrome. Crush syndrome is exactly what it sounds like, a syndrome that can develop after someone has been physically crushed. In instances like earthquakes, whenever parts of buildings fall down on top of people, there is a phenomena that can happen where they are saved by a rescue crew and they had an arm or a leg get totally destroyed underneath the rubble, and they're freed and they're alive for a few days, and then suddenly they die of kidney failure. The reason being, their muscles being destroyed ground them up to such a degree that the myoglobin flows through their bloodstream, and typically myoglobin gets released through your kidneys. Everyone has a little bit of myoglobin in their blood, and it's all filtered out through your kidneys typically. But if you have a huge amount rush to your kidneys at once, it jams up your kidneys and you die of kidney failure. The normal amount of myoglobin that a human has in their blood, or at least the top end of the healthy amount that a human can have in their blood, is about 60 nanograms per milliliter. At this moment, Hisashi had 1,800. So it seems that the right hand and arm that were close to the reaction whenever it happened were decomposing and radiated to such a degree that his muscles were liquefying, and now the proteins of his muscles that are in his blood are risking shutting down his kidney. While discussing their options, the delegate from Russia, in the most Russian suggestion ever, says they should just amputate the arm. And if this was under normal circumstances, that would be true. His arm is effectively poisoning him, so you'd want to cut it off. But again, this is the guy they didn't want to do endoscopies on because they were afraid they'd nick a corner and cause him to bleed to death, so they can't cut off his arm. But effectively, his arm is melting and it's poisoning his whole body. And it seems that so much of his inner tissue was beginning to dissolve and his body was trying to pass it through his system that he was getting about 3 liters of diarrhea a day, all from the inner parts of his body just sloughing off. On top of this, regions on his body where skin had been removed, like where the tape was and on his feet, just became these blistered masses. These blisters would then pop and just begin leaking fluid from his system. A lot of the diarrhea and the fluid that was pouring out of these blisters wasn't natural to his body. He was hooked up to so many different IVs that were trying to pump his system with nutrients and fluids to keep him alive, and while some of it took, a lot of it just poured out of him. Normally, in situations like this, like for example a burn victim, you would cut off the bad or necrotic skin that is causing this and then just graft new skin on. However, with the radiation, it was hard to tell what parts of his body were good skin and what parts were bad. And once again, you can't just fillet the guy because then he'll bleed out. So they began to fully wrap his body with dressings and gauze. Effectively, this gauze acted like a new layer of skin because he had lost so much at this point that his body just slowly and constantly let out fluids and blood. So the gauze act as a temporary barrier. He was wrapped in so much gauze that the only parts of his body that were exposed were his eyes and the tips of his feet. His wife remarked after seeing him like this, "There's nowhere we can touch him now." Also, keep in mind that he constantly bled and seeped through these bandages, so they had to be replaced daily. It took a team of 10 people 3 hours every day to change his bandages. Another thing that the skin does that you don't really think about until you need it is regulate your body temperature. Skin works as an insulating layer that keeps all of your heat inside. But now that Hisashi has lost most of his skin, he can't regulate his body temp. So whenever they took off these bandages, there was a real threat that he would become hypothermic because all the heat would leave him. So they kept the room he was in at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning this team of 10 people had to work through sweat and heat exhaustion for 3 hours straight to quickly change the bandages across his body. They also had to be super careful with how they wrapped the bandages because anywhere too tight could destroy the muscle or what little skin was still there. They would also weigh the bandages after they took it off of him because they put clean gauze on, he soaks into it overnight, and whenever they take it off the next day, the amount of fluid that's in the bandage indicates how much fluid he's lost. So at this time, he was losing about 1 liter of fluid a day through his skin. Also at this point, the lining around his eyes began to deteriorate and he started bleeding from his eyes, as well as all of his fingernails and toenails fell off. Typically, if say this was a type of burn that wasn't radioactive, they could perform a skin graft. However, they can't perform the skin graft because of the chromosome damage that his good skin does have and the whole bleed out thing. Also, he did have good skin. If you'll remember, it was the front and right side of his body that was facing the reactor. So the back left side of his body was, on the exterior, mostly intact. He still suffered the biological damage, but his outer layer of skin wasn't rotting off. So, since the sister was a match for the stem cell transplant, they decided to use her skin to grow a skin graft. This would take 2 to 4 weeks, but the sister provided a sample of her skin to be grown in a laboratory that could then be put on Hisashi. Also, the dermatologist examining him during this time noticed that on the border of the burnt skin and the okay skin, there were these tiny white dots that started to form. It turns out these dots were new skin cells. Meaning that even if his body wasn't able to produce a new immune system or part of his digestive system, it seemed that eventually he could be capable of growing new skin. Even though all of the skin that he had currently was damaged, it seemed like he may be able to make healthy skin at some point in the future. Again, this is all assuming that they can keep him alive for that long. He continued with this process of bandages and fluids until in November, when he was losing about 2 liters of fluid a day just through his skin. Seeing that the problem was this bad and that he had the potential of growing new skin, they decided to set temporary skin grafts. In other words, they take skin grafts that they know probably won't take because, the donor's not exactly right, and effectively use the skin grafts as a replacement bandage. Because if they set the skin down on top of his body and it can, for at least a little while, contain some of the fluid, then maybe that can cause his body to jumpstart the rebuilding process and he can grow his own skin. So on November the 18th, again 50 days after the initial exposure, they decided to perform several temporary skin replacements. They couldn't cut his body because, again, the whole bleeding thing. So instead, his skin was so weak that they would just take like a towel or a sponge and rub parts of his skin a little bit and all the skin would peel off. So after it was peeled off, they would then take these grafts and stitch them down on top of each other, all connected in some kind of patchwork design that would then be rejected by his body, but it seemed to last longer than the bandages and hopefully got his body to start building skin cells. All in all, Hisashi would end up going through 70 skin grafts, each lasting about 3 to 4 days. Again, this was all in an attempt to get his body to start making its own skin. But then, the same day that they were doing the skin grafts, the very thing Maekawa was afraid of happened. On November the 18th, they examined Hisashi's stool, and sure enough, it contained blood, meaning that he had a bleed somewhere in his intestines. So they do another endoscope to see how bad the damage to the intestines is, and his entire gut is just full of blood. As a matter of fact, he was excreting through his feces about 800 milliliters of blood a day. However, in the midst of this horrible information, there was a slight sign of hope. While looking at the area between his small and large intestine, there were these small white spots, which according to the gastroenterologist seemed to be new mucous membranes. Even though all of the mucous membranes had shed off earlier and been passed through his system, it seems that his body was trying to make new ones. Similar to the skin, even though it's a crack through the clouds, it is the slight sign that if they can weather this storm, his body will eventually repair itself. So in spite of the magnitude of his injuries, this encouraged them to keep pushing forward. Until the next day, on November the 19th, when it was found that he was also bleeding into his stomach. By November the 19th, between the fluid seeping from his skin and the fluid he was excreting from his body, he was losing 10 liters of blood and fluids every day. And everywhere that was bleeding, they couldn't hope for the bleed to stop because, again, his platelet count was so low. What little repair was done by his sister's transfusion had been undone by the damage in his body. So the only thing they could do is keep pumping him full of more blood. And whatever blood went into him just came back out. He was effectively an open filter that blood and fluids just kept getting passed through. It got to the point that in 1/2 day of the nurse's shift, they had to do 10 blood transfusions. Between this and the breathing machine and making sure he doesn't get bed sores and making sure his skin doesn't fall off and changing his bandages and everything else, it is amazing that this guy was even technically alive with all of the machines and drugs in his system. Now, it is hopeful that during this time, because of the intense level of damage done to his skin and, a lot of the systems of his body, that hopefully his nervous system quit working. But if it didn't, he would live through his body rotting. It would effectively be a conscious decomposition. Every system of his body was bleeding and burning and falling apart, and he lived through it. Even take the most brutal torture methods you've ever heard of, like the boats where they would put someone in these two upside down boats and push them out into the water and fill them with honey so that flies would lay eggs in their body and ants would crawl inside of them. Or stories of people being burned alive, or things like the brazen bull. Even in a situation like the boats where you're being eaten from the inside out, at least your arms are okay, right? At least your legs are okay. Maybe you can, the top of your head isn't burning, right? Everything hurts in here, but at least there's some extremities that are okay. And in cases where people are immolated, just burned alive, that lasts an hour at most in some cases, which is still an excruciating amount of time, but normally it's over decently fast. But with Hisashi, he had to fill every single inch of his body in constant misery, rotting and falling off. And it didn't last for a few minutes. It didn't last for an hour. By the end of this, it lasted for 83 days. There isn't a single more painful, brutal death that I could imagine. Maybe there are worse deaths, depending on your definition of worst. Maybe there's, genocides that have been committed that are tragic, or horrible stories of, say, children taken before their time, and things that we might say are worse. But as far as painful, I can't think and don't want to think of a scenario that tops this. Watching your body rot while you're still in it. In spite of all of this, his family remained hopeful. His family still came to see him at every single visitation. They'd walk up to him and talk about how strong and how brave he was. And the doctors would talk to him constantly. Every time the nurses came to change his bandages, they would still speak to him. They'd talk about what the weather was like, what was happening in news or politics in the country. They always maintained that he was the same person now that he was when he was talking about fishing and how much he loved his wife the first week he arrived. The question that a lot of nurses and a lot of doctors were asking at the time is this right? How long do we keep this man alive? And I want to dispel a rumor right now. Whenever you read about this case, a lot of the narrative around it is that, these crazy scientists were keeping him alive against his will, and he kept begging to die, but they kept doing more tests and wanted to perform more experiments. And that's not what happened. This case has a lot of weird misinformation about it too, by the way. Like, for example, there's a picture of a guy laying in a bed with his arms and legs up who's like burn all over. And anywhere you Google, they're like, yep, that's a picture of Hisashi Uchi. It's not. That is the picture from a medical textbook about burn treatments. A news reporter probably, or someone online said that was Hisashi, and everyone else just ran with it. It was like, yep, that's a picture of the irradiated man. But it's not. It's just a burn victim. And I think it's because people weirdly want to sensationalize this story, but it doesn't need it beyond, what it already is. It's already such a tragic tale, but they make it into like, here's a picture of his body mangled, and the doctors kept performing experiments, and it's weird. But the tone I got out of every doctor from every interview was this constant struggle of them knowing that they need to perform their jobs, that they assured Hisashi they're going to keep him alive as long as they can, that they assured the family they're going to keep him alive as long as they can, and then coming to see the state he's in and wondering if they're trying to play God. And also, at the end of the day, these doctors weren't doing anything beyond the standard. Because the way it is with radiation victims is you just have to survive the symptoms and then their body will come out of it. And as drastic as the symptoms have been, would it be better for the doctors to say, oh, well, he's costing too much blood transfusions, or his body seems too damaged in this area, we should just let him die? Some of the nurses thought to themselves that, yeah, maybe we should just let him die. Maybe that's what would be best. But regardless of this, the doctors doubled down and said, our job is to keep him alive because as horrible as these symptoms can be, as long as there is a micro chance to save him, as long as the walls of his intestines may grow back, as we've seen evidence of, and some of his skin may grow back, then it's worth the time. It's worth most of the doctors living in the hospital. It's worth doing several 2-hour meetings a day and then going to his family and explaining what happened. It's worth 3 hours of bandage changes. It's worth some of the medical residents who were there having to type up 2 8-page reports a day to present to all of the doctors. It's worth the countless hours to save his life if there's a chance. And obviously I can't speak for Hisashi, but knowing that with the last words he said before he was intubated, when he saw his family and they told him to stay strong for them, and he saw his wife and his son, and he just gritted his teeth and bared it. I like to think that that was his answer. Because a lot of people say, well, Hisashi couldn't speak. Maybe he wanted to die. Maybe he wanted to slip on. And yeah, with the pain he experienced, I wouldn't blame him if at some point he did. But I like to think that right before they intubated him and he agreed to push forward for his family and told his wife that he loved her, I like to think that that was his answer. That even if there was a chance that he could stay alive for them, that he'd suffer through it. And if I was in that position, if I decided that I'm willing to endure whatever pain or cost there was to stay alive for my family, then I would hope that I had a team of doctors as adamant and loyal as Hisashi did. And also, again, everything you read about this, they're like the evil doctors who kept a man alive and wouldn't let him die. Like, do people see this story of a guy who spent 83 days and a whole team of doctors and then fighting against, the disease that was all over him? And are they like, not interesting enough? But if the doctors were evil, if we make the doctors into like these comic book villains, that's a story. And during this time, the doctors were trying to do everything they could for the pain. He was on a mix of propofol, fentanyl, and ketamine hydrochloride. The doses he was taking was about the same of someone who would be awake during open brain surgery. And despite the strength of that, it is likely that they began to lose their effectiveness as he was introduced to more and more painkillers over the days that followed. But again, the only thing they can do is treat the symptoms and hope that he comes out of it. Also, with this insane amount of drugs constantly pumping through his system, his heart was having a hard time getting any circulation to his extremities. So he maintained a heart rate of about 120 from October onwards. Effectively, this guy's heart was constantly running a marathon with no breaks for over a month. As they were maintaining his condition, on November the 27th, which was day 59 since exposure, on November the 27th at 7:01 a.m., Meikawa was walking down the hallway and looked into Hisashi's room and saw that his blood pressure was 40 over 30. For those that don't know, a healthy blood pressure is 80 over 120, which meant that Hisashi's heart was about to give out. Meikawa rushed into the room, called a code, got a ton of people in there, and they immediately began giving CPR. See, normally, Hisashi was hooked up to dozens of different devices that constantly monitored his heart rate and would alert the entire hospital if he was to have a heart attack or if his system was to stop or anything like that. But about an hour before, they had removed a lot of the equipment to do x-rays. And while the current technicians were down the hallway looking at the x-ray pictures, it was the one window of time that his system could have stopped and all of the doctors wouldn't have been around to get it restarted. And if it hadn't been for Maekawa just walking by, no one would have noticed it. Or at least not noticed it before it was too late. When they ran into the room, he wasn't breathing and didn't have a heartbeat. So again, they began performing CPR and delivered epinephrine. So his heart initially stopped at 7:01 a.m. At 7:10, his heart starts again. At 7:25, it stops again. At 7:34, it starts again. At 7:50, it stops again. Then finally, at 8:14, it starts and maintains a blood pressure of 125/86 and 164 beats per minute. All in all, Hisashi died 3 times and his heart was stopped for a total of 49 minutes. Now, typically, that would cause undisputable massive brain damage. But because Hisashi was still hooked up to so many pumps that were effectively helping his heart run blood through his system for him, they figured that enough blood stayed in his brain that it didn't just make him brain dead. They ran tests to confirm, but it seems that while on a normal person 49 minutes of no heartbeat would kill you, on Hisashi it seemed to not, although he almost definitely got significant brain damage from it. Hopefully, he did experience brain damage enough that he wasn't conscious for a lot of the pain that followed, because one of the things that happened immediately following his heart stopping was his kidneys stopped entirely. So they had to hook him up to a dialysis machine that ran 24/7 as his new kidneys. His blood work also showed that he was about to undergo liver failure as well. Maekawa gave the information to Hisashi's family, who, remember, is still living in the waiting room on the first floor, and after telling them everything that happened, they said, even if his heart stopped, it started again. He'll get better. During this time, the family would visit Hisashi and tell him to hang in there, and that he's being so strong, and that they're all proud of him. Perhaps to support the idea that he didn't suffer a lot after that series of heart attacks, while his brain showed that there was still activity, he no longer responded to stimuli. He no longer would grab their hand or move his eyes or nod or anything like that. He seemed to be completely vegetative. Which leads to 2 options. One, he was effectively dead at that point and didn't feel anything, which would be, the much kinder option. The other option is that now, on top of all of the pain and suffering, he can't move at all. Some of the nurses said that every now and then there would be like the move of an eyebrow or the slight tinge in a finger or toe, but they couldn't be sure if that was just like an involuntary action or if that was him still in there. Also, it seemed at this point that his heart was entirely ran by medication, because anytime that they tried to stifle him off the medication to see how he did, his heart would immediately start to tank in blood pressure and they had to crank it back up. So there is a possibility that his body was effectively dead, but the vasopressors and other drugs they were running to like keep pressure in his heart was just causing the chemical reactions to keep happening. Or again, the horrifying alternative that he was conscious for all of this. On December the 1st, after 63 days in, yet another problem occurs when it's found out that he has hemophagocytosis. This is a condition where the macrophages in your blood, part of your immune system, starts eating your blood. So this required that he have a full plasma transfusion, which he did. Typically in plasma transfusions, the max you'll see is 8 units of plasma. He had to have 75. A complete plasma replacement that took 3 days to do. On December the 7th, 3 p.m., shortly after the transfusion, his body once again went into shock, where he was administered more epinephrine to come back out of it. At the same time, his white blood cell count dipped back down to 1,000, where it was at 10,000, so most of the good that was done by the original stem cell transfusion had been undone. And at this point, he was entirely automated. From needing new blood to new immunities in his blood, to blood transfusions in his lungs, and his heart, and his blood flow, and every aspect of his body was automated to some degree. Even his kidneys were now a box that sat across the room from him. So, Maekawa, who has been entirely dependent this entire time on keeping this man alive because there is a chance that he will get better. After seeing the evidence that his heart is just a box that drugs are keeping running, and after seeing that every aspect of his body that still works is trying to kill the rest of it, like the hemophagocytosis, and needs replaced by something else, and they just keep changing out skin and blood and bandages, that he's effectively just a robot, a marionette that they keep running more strings through. And on December the 19th at 11:30 p.m., 81 days in, Maekawa came to the conclusion that they shouldn't do anymore. He goes to the family and he takes them into an office that has all of Hisashi's vitals and stats and charts and everything laid out on computer screens, and takes hours explaining to them in detail why every single thing is happening, while this drug affects this and this pressure affects this, to help them fully understand exactly where they are at, to understand that at this point, Hisashi is not Hisashi. He is a body that is controlled by other things. And he concludes and says, the next time that his heart stops, we shouldn't try to start it again. And after hearing all of this, the family simply replies, we understand. There's a lot of malice around the family in this story as well. Like whenever you read reports about it, they're always like the evil doctors and the selfish family. That's the tone everyone has. Like, oh, his family was like, we don't care if he won't make it. Keep torturing him is like the way, again, people, I keep saying people, weird YouTube channels and content farm news outlets, okay? That's who I mean by people. But it's because they always want everything to be so two-dimensional. They don't want to talk about nuance or, the terror of, do I keep a family member alive or not? But up until this point, it has never been impossible for him to live. At some point, the radiation symptoms would stop and he would be able to live. And, could you imagine how different this story would be if he did live? If this guy went through 20 sieverts of exposure and lived, came out of it on the other side, and despite all of these transfusions and monsters, he got to raise his son. No one would be like, oh, why'd you keep him alive then? It's only because it didn't work that they feel this way. And keep in mind, this had never happened before. Someone was never exposed to this much and stayed living. Perhaps because it stayed living, something about his body was strong enough, something could beat it. It could be a breakthrough for radiation exposure for eons to come. But it's because he didn't live that everyone gets pointed a finger at. The medical team gets called monsters, the family gets called selfish, but this entire time, it was just a family, a wife who wanted to keep her husband alive, a son who wanted to see his dad. That was it. And I hate a lot of the tones that get put around him because they're like, he begged for death, but his family wouldn't let him go. They would just go to his bedside and tell him to stay strong, to keep fighting. Because, if there was a chance that someone you loved could live, wouldn't you want them to keep pushing? And again, maybe somewhere in his broken state of being, he decided that he wanted to go. Again, I wouldn't blame him. But, man, the family is not evil for wanting to save him. And the doctors are not evil for trying to. And it's really heartbreaking that the story gets kind of seen that way, because on all ends it was a tragedy that this had to be experienced, any of this happened in the first place. And I think a lot of the malice people attribute to the family is done away with in the simple lines they said to Maekawa when they said, we understand. You've done everything you can. You've gone above and beyond to save Hisashi. And now you're telling us that you shouldn't try to save him again, and we get it. The next day, the 82nd day, on December the 20th, the family came in to have their final goodbye, effectively, or in case something happens, their final goodbye. They hadn't seen his face since the doctors had put bandages over them, so the nurses decided that they were going to take off the bandages and put T-Rex gauze down, which is much thinner, so they could kind of see an outline of his face. At this point, super care about, infections or anything that comes isn't as important. So they clean him up as much as they can to see his family. And whenever the family walks into the room and sees his face, a lot of them began crying. A lot of them, at least, except for his wife, who still maintains her strength. They begin thanking the staff, saying that he looks great, that they cleaned him up, and that they appreciate them putting on the lower gauze so that they could get an outline of his face, because they knew they didn't have to do that, but they appreciated the gesture. Also during this time, his poor blood circulation stopped the antifungals he was taking from working, and he had developed a fungus began to develop on him known as aspergillus, which feeds on fluids excreted from the body. So in the mix of all of this charred looking flesh and blood, he had this whitish gray mold that began growing around his torso. Also at this point, they just kept upping the dosage of the drugs that kept his body running. And at this point, he was on like an elephant's dose of epinephrine and other drugs just to keep his heart beating. So on December the 21st, day 83, they decided to stop upping the dose. At 9:35 p.m., his vitals slowly start to taper off. And then at around 10:30 p.m., he suddenly flatlines. The doctors give a quick shot of epinephrine to see if that's all it takes to keep his heart running for a little bit longer. And when that doesn't work, they ordered the nurses to go get his family. At the doctors' and family's wishes, they decided not to resuscitate him. And finally, at 11:21 p.m. on December the 21st of 1999, the 35-year-old Hisashi Uchi was pronounced dead. They then began the process of taking off all of the machines and equipment and bandages that had been on him. And one of the nurses, Nurse Shibita, who was there for most of the treatment, began to cry after seeing him because every single thing that had happened to him was shown on his body. The places where the tape had been and that these boils had broken out, and these spots on his body where he was bruised from, the equipment laying on it. It's like his body told a story. And in an interview she gave about her time with him, she said the phrase, "His body was the crystallization of his perseverance," which is a beautiful way to look at it. At the same time, after they had taken everything off of him, the wife wanted to come see him now that, none of the equipment was on. And she walks into the room and she sees her dead husband and all the stuff that had been done to him, all his battle wounds. And for the first time, she cries. She breaks down on the floor and cries because now she doesn't have to be strong for him anymore. Now she can finally let it out. There in front of, for the first time, her husband unabridged, uncovered with all the devices that were in front of him. And That night they performed an autopsy, and the medical examiner began at 4:03 a.m. The front of his body was completely red and black. It looked like someone had intense scalding burns to the front portion of their body, but the back, at least appearance-wise, was fine. Again, the part of his body that was facing the reaction was the one that was the most damaged. When they cut him open, the sight was incredible. His intestines had expanded into what looked like these giant balloon animals. His intestines were so swelled up and tender from everything that was happening that it seems the bleeds were just stretches in them as they began to grow and inflate. In his stomach, there were 2.04 kilograms of blood, and in his intestine, 2.68 kilograms of blood. Every single mucous membrane in his body was destroyed, from his intestines and throat and nose, like I mentioned earlier, but also the ones in his lungs and trachea were just gone. The original stem cells that were donated from his sister could not be recovered in his bone marrow, indicating that perhaps his body completely eradicated the transplant. That would also explain why his white blood cell count shot so low near the end. One of the most incredible injuries that happened were his muscle fibers. Where he normally would have muscle fibers with, the cell membrane and the fibers in them that, are muscles, instead, the fibers were completely gone, completely dissolved and passed through his system, and all that was left was the cell membrane. This guy's muscles dissolved while he was still alive, in a way that's normally only seen in decomposition. But what is, without a doubt, the most remarkable part of this entire autopsy, keep in mind, his body is rotted, right? And every system of his body's destroyed. He's burnt up everywhere. It's like an impossible amount of damage. In the midst of all of it, his heart was completely fine. Like, sure, there were elements of stress from the amount that it was pumping, but there was no visible burns, damage, or anything permanent found in his heart's tissue. This baffled the medical examiner and everyone who was watching. The only theories is perhaps the concoction of drugs they gave, combined with, the damage of radiation, created some wild loophole in medicine that the tissue of his heart was kept in check. But no one to this day has any idea how his heart managed to stay there, to stay in its condition. And the medical examiner made the comment that he likes to think that it was solely Hisashi's will to live, as symbolic as it is, the idea that the heart managed to endure everything. But in spite of everything, his heart made it. After 4.5 hours, the autopsy concluded at 8:37 a.m. The official cause of death was ruled as organ dysfunction due to radiation exposure. And at 9:45 a.m., Hisashi was buried by his family. Shortly after this, Hisashi's wife would visit the hospital and thank all of the nurses and physicians for the care that they gave to her husband. Now, if you'll remember, there was another guy, or two other guys, who were exposed to radiation at the same time Hisashi was. For one, the boss, who only experienced 3 sieverts, which again is way more than anyone ever should, but the boss who only experienced 3 turned out to be okay. He went through radiation sickness and he had some mild symptoms and burning, but his was a more typical case. They managed to get him through it and he lived. The guy who was pouring the bucket, Masato Shinohara, wasn't as lucky. He was exposed to about half the radiation of Hisashi, which is still way more than a lethal dose. The thing that makes Hisashi so remarkable is no one had ever been exposed to that amount of radiation and then lived for that long, but there had been people who were exposed to the amount of radiation that Masato experienced. Masato went into Meikawa's care on April the 10th of 2000. See, the main difference between their times in the hospital between Hisashi and Masato is that with Masato, most of the treatments worked, at least for much longer than they did on Hisashi. Like 10 days in, Masato had a similar stem cell transplant, and it seemed to work fine. It got his immune system back in order. Whenever his skin began to burn and started to seep off, they were able to graft skin from the rest of his body because his chromosomes weren't as damaged as Hisashi's was. However, 2 months before his transfer to Meikawa, he had developed blood in his stool, which again is a common killer with radiation exposure. And also in March, because remember his immune system, while better than Hisashi's, is still compromised, he got a MRSA infection that led to pneumonia. He was transferred to Meikawa's care 194 days after exposure. He was put on dialysis because his kidneys were going down, and his lungs and liver had significant damage. His death was much more slow and less intense than Hisashi's. He eventually passed away at 7:25 a.m. on April the 27th, day 211 after exposure, at the age of 40 years old. Whenever they went to do his autopsy, his skin had hardened to where they described it as armor coating his body. His death was more typical of radiation exposure. It wasn't the immediate pain and burning everywhere that Hisashi's was, and he maintained his consciousness for most of his time in the hospital. 6 of the bosses at JCO were arrested, including the boss who was in the room with the 2 men at the time of the criticality. All were sentenced to 2 to 3 years in jail. All of their defenses were that they didn't understand how dangerous this was because, again, this was not a nuclear facility. This was a place where they make materials for the nuclear facility. So a lot of them claimed that they just figured these were like any other chemicals, like, yeah, don't breathe it in or touch it, but you're okay to be in like near vicinity of it, and none of them thought it was possible. And I don't know about the other 5, but I do believe the boss who was in the room, because when that guy says he didn't think that could happen, he was right next to the container whenever it went nuclear. So I take his word for it. The accident seems to be caused by arrogance across the board. Safety guidelines were not being followed, people didn't understand what they were handling, and all in all, it led to the horrible death of 2 people who weren't responsible. In 2001, physician Meikawa would retire and published the Good Practice Guidelines for Radiation Emergency Medicine, which was the first full-blown guideline in Japan of how medical teams are to assemble and deal with radiation damage. On June the 6th of 2005, the JCO plant where the accident occurred was torn down. Despite being 6 years since that day, the tank was still radioactive whenever they came to take it down. The tank can actually be viewed now at a nuclear history museum in Japan. And in that hospital waiting room, to this day, the paper cranes that were made by Hisashi's family are still there. All in all, they number about 10,000. One of the nurses who was speaking of the case said that she couldn't bear to take him down, as they had too many prayers attached to him. And it seems that those prayers pushed the impossible radioactive man to survive longer and with a better heart than anyone else ever has. And with that, we have the end of the story of the most painful death ever experienced. Again, a lot of people talk about the story, at least on YouTube, online, as being almost like a horror tale of evil doctors and an evil family causing this guy to suffer. And while obviously the details of the injuries that happened are horrific, I don't see it as that. Nothing I've read, no interview has indicated any of that to me. It was good doctors who questioned themselves, sure, but were determined to keep this man alive if there was a slimmer of a chance, and a family who was willing to support him in whatever the doctors and Hisashi thought was best. There was no malice here. At worst, maybe a family who didn't understand the extent of the injuries, but is that a crime? Or doctors who are willing to do everything to honor the last wishes they'd heard from him and the current wishes of the family. And I don't think that's wrong either. It was just a tragic situation from every side. And it's a story that I think deserves to be told. And if you stuck around this long, hopefully you enjoyed's not the right word. Endured hearing through it. And I appreciate that because I wanted to talk about it. And I'm glad you're here and I'm glad you're still watching. And I just want to say thank you for watching. This case is, again, it's similar to the toxic, what was it? Yeah, it was called The Toxic Woman. The video I covered a couple uploads back about a woman who had this strange toxic reaction. And everyone online treats that story as a supernatural tale. And then this story they treat as a malicious tale. I read some stories that were completely unfounded where they were and it seems the doctors were being paid by the government to try all these experimental procedures, but none of that happened. It was just, I guess people want to make it scary rather than tragic, which is what it is. And I wanted to shed some light to it and also talk about a lot of the insane medical details of the case that I don't think it covered enough. So anyway, I've talked about enough. If you watched this long, then hopefully you agree that these details are worth talking about. And thank you for being here. One thing I do want to mention. So a lot of the time when I make these videos, I'll read books or journal articles or whatever that are really data heavy. It's kind of this date this happened or this was the diagnosis. But for this video, the main source I used, which it seems a lot of other sources or a lot of other articles that came later used, was a book that was published in the early 2000s called A Slow Death, 83 Days of Radiation Sickness, that was written by one of the reporters who showed up at the JCO plant the day the incident happened. And he spent years going to all of the doctors, nurses, and family members, getting an exact timeline of what happened, and all of the information he gathered in it was firsthand. And the reason I mention it is because rather than a lot of stories that are data heavy, he really did a great job. The author, I'll put his name up here, I forgot it right now. He did a great job at crafting a narrative out of the scientific and analytical pieces. And I thought it was a great read. So if you're interested in this story, I recommend you read that book. However, I will warn you going into it, it is biased. So what I was about to say earlier, I wanted to say that to preference. One of the angles a lot of people take with this story is an anti-nuclear energy narrative. I mean, as you could imagine, people who don't like nuclear energy and then see incidents like this happen, obviously use it as an example of why there shouldn't be nuclear energy. But at the same, and I swear I'm not getting political, I'm not qualified. But at the same time, I don't see it as much as nuclear energy being the problem as much as it is greed, stupidity, corporations wanting to cut corners and then risk the lives of workers to do it. Like, that's where the problem came from. And you could say, that's the same thing, because how could nuclear energy exist without corporate greed and whatnot? But I feel like that's addressing a symptom rather than the problem. But anyway, just know that if you decide to read the book, that there is a lot of that inserted. There's a lot of like hypothetical quotes about like how nuclear energy is bad. There's a lot of quotes from like people around World War II talking about how that nukes are evil and whatnot. And like, just if you go into it, understand that there is some bias. But the story and narrative itself is very well put together, and the basis I used for this video. So check out that book. Again, normally I don't recommend the books unless they're like fictional and that's what the video's about. But here, if you're interested, check it out. So I believe that should do it for now. New content on the way. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. I'm going to go start getting to editing this, and hopefully you all can see it soon. Well, if you're already watching it, you've already seen it. I'm tired. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Also, just before we go, thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in my description and use code Wendigoon55 to get 55% off your first month. So that should do it for now, but I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.